All right, welcome to Witchpolice Radio. Regular listeners to this show will be aware that the main focus of Witchpolice Radio has always been talking about the music scene here in Winnipeg and in Manitoba, and then I like to say Manitoba adjacent. And a lot of the time, I try to shoehorn the guests into that description, even if they don't necessarily fit it. And I think that this guest on this episode is a good example.
Hmm.
We're going to get into sort of who you are and what you do in a second, but I think this is maybe one of the biggest stretches I've had as far as trying to force it into the theme. But as we'll talk about, we do have a little bit of a connection that I think might work. So, um, just start this off. The best way to do this is if you want to introduce yourself and give a bit of background about what it is you do.
My name is Aaron Carnes. I've been a music journalist for, I don't know, 15 plus years. I wrote a book in 2021 called In Defense of Ska, and I started a podcast in 2021 called In Defense of Ska. And then, on October 29th this year, I am releasing an expanded second edition of In Defense of Ska, and the podcast continues.
Awesome, and the podcast is great. I mean, I've definitely I probably don't need to explain this to people who know me or know the show, but I was in a ska band in the late '90s, kind of when it was having its last very large eruption of popularity, I guess. I've always
Mhm.
been a fan of the genre. I talk about it fairly regularly, and so I think that when I started listening to your podcast, it was great because it gave me a lot of insight into artists that either I still listen to or I had listened to once upon a time, and
Mhm.
reacquainted me with them. Obviously, in order to do this book, you've been, I'm assuming, fairly heavily immersed in ska, sort of, eating, sleeping,
Yeah.
breathing the genre. But I guess to start this off, I feel, and I think this comes through in the book as well, that ska has unfortunately got this negative reputation now, years after its last big public mainstream push, right? So, what is your sort of take on the way that ska is perceived? And I'm assuming that's sort of part of the impetus for writing this book in the first place.
Well, I think ska is perceived like like a guilty pleasure, maybe like just kind of something with little value to it, something that was goofy.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's the same in Canada, but in the US it's a very strong narrative. And I know in some other countries it's not really the same narrative. And I think that the the thing that we're left with, I think the thing that we're dealing with is that the legacy is pretty strong, and it really impacts people's ability to how they digest ska music of the past, and how or when, if they allow new bands to really gain traction. Like, I think you are seeing some increase in interest in ska and new ska bands, but if you look at other genres like emo or hardcore, pop punk,
Yeah.
like I feel like you're seeing bigger resurgences and a greater allowance for them to be recontextualized for the moment right now. And I feel like ska is it's better now than it was 5, 6, 7 years ago, but I do still feel like it's fairly weighted down by all of this like baggage.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that it seems to a lot of people to be so permanently associated with a time and place, which is funny because that time and place is one of many times and places that ska has had
Yeah, yeah.
over its like really lengthy history. But people tend to really drill down on that late '90s sort of punk with horns sort of vibe, which obviously is not indicative of the genre as a whole. But that's probably when they heard it when they were in high school in their early '20s, whatever, and that's sort of ingrained in their mind as what the genre is. And I think you're right about hardcore and emo. I mean, I have a teenage kid in high school, and some of her friends are into emo, and there's no shame about that. Whereas a few years back, it seemed almost like emo was a swear word, and but now it's accepted again. And ska, I think you're right. Even here as well, it still has that stigma, which is weird. Like, so why ska for you? I mean, I know from your book and from your podcast that you were in a ska band. You've done this same thing as a
Hmm.
lot of us have done, but you sort of stuck with it, like a lot of people haven't, as far as following these bands and sticking with the genre and still being immersed in it. Where a lot of people from that era dropped off. I mean, like I said, I was in a band. We did a reunion on my podcast a few years back. I think I'm the only one who still listens to ska out of the dozen people who were in the band, and I think that's fairly typical of a lot of people that were sort of involved 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah, I think for me, as a teenager, early 20s, ska was probably the kind of music that was most meaningful to me. Um, so in terms of like my initial sort of like interest in the music is very important to me, but why I like sort of pursue this sort of mission now, I don't think it's like because I love ska so much, I must do it. I think it's more my journalism brain sees this sort of lack, sees
Sure.
this sort of like, why aren't people caring about this, or why aren't people like some of it's like why don't people like take these bands seriously, like why don't they ask them real questions and give them long in-depth interviews and like look at their history with like a sense of importance rather than
Yeah.
like a lot of people that are in ska bands even now, like who were in ska bands are getting interviewed now outside of the sort of ska bubble. It's like, what's ska? Explain ska. Like it's almost like they can't just exist as a band within the context of their own like legacy, or have people who even understand the subculture that they come from talk about it within that framework. So I guess I'm drawn to that. I'm drawn to being able to dig into that and sort of provide that.
And so, how long did this book take to write? Because I mean, I mean, I know you have the second edition coming out, which is even more content, and obviously doing the podcast, you're constantly doing interviews with these bands and artists and people involved in the
Mhm.
scene. So I imagine you can probably continue adding to the book sort of forever. But the initial book itself, how much work was that to put together all the interviews and research and everything else?
Well, I would say it took me 7 years, but it wasn't really 7 years of consistent hard work. It was like the first 5 years were me doing other stuff and kind of doing interviews and working on the book when I had time
Yeah.
as a secondary project. But the last couple of years, I kind of reorganized my life and really put the book first and everything else second. So I did a huge chunk of it in those 2 years. The second edition, I did a good amount of work in about a year's time. But I also like a lot of the work was done through the podcast. Like I took interviews I did with the podcast, and I was like, it's research.
Sure.
Is I interviewed these people, so I went ahead and included that as research for the book for the second edition. Yeah,
And that's endless. Yes, you could do many more
yeah.
editions with it because your show is. How many episodes are you in at this point?
We are around 189, 190 at the time of this recording.
Yeah, so there's I'm sure there's plenty more to dig in there. And just to kind of tie this to the local thing, I mean, I guess we previously existed not in the same interview, but on the same episode of another podcast that Greg Soden, who has guest hosted a few of my shows as well, the Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda, talking about
Mhm.
the whole Scott Sucks phenomenon and Winnipeg
Yeah.
band propaganda and Winnipeg band Whole Lotta Milka and that whole thing, which is cool that weird little blip that seems so hyper local to me, and I think to a lot of people here, that it had any kind of impact. Like the fact that anyone knows what Ska Sucks is outside of Winnipeg is bizarre to me. But obviously, clearly, it was a huge thing, right? That song, I mean, Propaganda got so huge on that one record, and that song went everywhere. But just in listening to your show, I mean, people should listen to that episode if they want to hear the conversation about that song. But I was listening to your episode with Matt from the Planet Smashers, and I listened to your episode a while back with Bedouin Soundclash, and it's very interesting to hear you reacting to sort of what the Canadian ska scene was like from an outsider's perspective. Because things like that Bedouin Soundclash single, which was ubiquitous here, you couldn't avoid it. And this is like, I guess, in the early 2000s, and didn't really make an impact in the States. And I think it
Yeah.
almost seems like the ska scene internationally seems so small and tight knit, but it really wasn't. I mean, there was all these sort of different scenes happening in different places that had similarities, but I mean, some of the South American scenes and stuff too that I've learned about from your show and your book and other places. It's weird it all kind of existed in tandem with each other, but there's definitely differences.
I learned fairly recently when we had Frank Turner on the show that the Bedouin Soundclash single, When the Night Fills My Song, was also very huge in England.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he made it sound like it was pretty similarly huge in England as it was in Canada. So that was kind of interesting to hear. because it played on the radio there, and it made its way into various commercials as well, which I think was kind of the story with that song in Canada,
Yeah,
that
it
it
was
was
on Zeller's
it's
commercial, and yeah, yeah,
yeah, and so that combined with it being a radio hit sort of made it this, and then also I think being on some kids shows too sort of made it this like thing that everyone knew. When Bedouin Soundclash toured the US, they're like an opening band for ska bands, or they were on Warped Tour. You know, they're from what I'm told, maybe it was from you. I'm not sure. It was somebody was like they tour with ska bands in the US, but in Canada they like tour with indie rock bands. So they're more
yeah,
seen as an indie rock band. Yeah.
for sure. And I actually saw them in 2005 in Minneapolis, at the Warp Tour there, which is the closest one to us here in Winnipeg. And
Yeah.
they were on a tiny little side stage. And this was at the time when that album was out, that single was out. They were massive here. I'd seen them play to a packed house a few months earlier, and then there they are in this little side stage, and no one knows who they are. Just a few hours down the highway, really. I mean, just across the border. It's crazy. So I guess, how do you sort of contextualize all these different ska scenes when you're putting something together like this book? I mean, the podcast is different because you can pick and
Yeah.
choose different parts, but it's so much wider than it actually seems like it was at the time, right? Like there's so many different facets to this. So how did you decide what to focus on, and what to keep, what to cut, as far as this larger story of ska's existence?
Well, the focus of my book was to argue that ska has been dismissed and deserves to be reevaluated.
Yeah,
So from my point of view, what I was speaking about, it kind of really like revolves around mid to late 90s US ska. So I'm kind of using that as like a base point. Like this is the kind of music that has sort of impacted the view of people in the US largely and their take on ska. And so I kind of focused on it from that point of view. And I also tried to highlight a lot of bands that were around at the same time, but were not mainstream, because I felt like a lot of those bands sort of were counter to the mainstream's narrative of ska. Like
sure.
you had these bands like Hepcat or MU330, like they were bands that were known by people who took an interest in ska. But if for the people who sort of learned about ska through the radio or MTV, they might have not known about these bands. And so their view of ska being like Real Big Fish, Save Ferris, Goldfinger, like
Boss Tones,
had
that's
the,
about it. Yeah, yeah.
had they gotten deeper in, they would have saw that ska was a little bit more diverse than maybe their impression was just from that sort of like mainstream portrayal of it. So I wanted to show, I didn't actually do a super deep dive into the actual mainstream phenomenon of ska. Like I devote some time to that, but I'm trying to show that this time period and what leads up to that time period and what happens after that time
Yeah.
period was a much bigger thing than how it was portrayed. I think that was a lot of the point I was trying to make.
And
So
yeah, I mean, you do have
yeah.
a chapter on Real Big Fish, and yeah, you focus on some of these bands, but yeah, definitely there's more of the underground sort of within the ska community itself that is the focus of the book.
Yeah, because I was trying to say, Scott didn't like just jump on MTV out of nowhere in 1996. There was all kinds of context, and that sort of DIY scene, those hundreds of bands continued on during that.
Sure.
There was a whole scene happening at the same time, and the scene happened after that too. So it really kind of like challenges, I think, a lot of people's point of view of what the ska scene was or what the ska movement was.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think that people almost saw it as being similar to the swing revival, which was really, really
Mhm.
short lived and had only a handful of bands that, compared to the ska scene at least, that were actively
Yeah.
doing it. And it was just a blip on a pants commercial or something, and then, and then it ended a few months later. But I think people confuse the two because they just remember, like, the impression that I get or something, or a Save Ferris song, and that's it, and that's all they take away from it. But I think those bands that you mentioned, like Hepcat, for example, and MU330, a band like Fishbone, all of these ones that sort of weren't playing that sort of I guess the term is the mozzarella stick ska. They're the ones that I feel have lasted the best. I mean, I can put on a Hepcat record today and enjoy it as much as I did in 1997, and that's not
Mhm.
necessarily true for some of the more punk with horns, I guess, for lack of a better term, bands that I loved at the time. Some of those have not aged well, but I think that the ones that have been more sort of with the culture and less of a bandwagon sort of vibe are the ones
Hmm.
that have stuck around still.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I
Uh,
think it's like, like a lot of the stuff that was mainstream, I think that it was ska that was mixed with pop punk specifically,
yes, yeah,
which I think was like what was the most commercially viable version of it. And a lot of that had to do with pop punk going mainstream a year or two earlier. So
yeah.
it
You had
really
Green
kind of,
Day and all those bands like that. Yeah, for sure.
yeah. So it gave some context. So, the difference between Green Day and Offspring and Goldfinger, not a huge leap. It's,
No,
very it's within the same ballpark, right? So, and not everyone likes pop punk. I mean, it's just, I think like people see ska as this sort of like subgenre of pop punk, and it's not, but I understand why they think that. If they're
yeah,
seeing Green Day breaks, Offspring breaks, Rancid breaks, they have a ska song, Real Big Fish and all these bands. So it seems like it's a version of pop punk.
definitely. And it was marketed like that. I mean, especially
Yeah.
here, there was this compilation called Ska Tracks that came out in must have been 97 or something, 96, 97, that everyone here had here. It was one of those like cheap compilations that everyone I knew had it. And it had a lot of bands that are still good, a lot of the pop punk type stuff, and then there was just some straight up, Blink 182 song on there. No ska whatsoever, but they just, Universal or whoever was making it, this is how they're going to market it. Kids who like, they heard "Damn It" on the radio, now they want to go buy this, and maybe they'll like this weird thing with horns, right? It definitely, yeah. The way it was marketed was, this is the same thing. It's just maybe got different instruments.
So I think that's a lot of like a lot of the legacy, the problem in the legacy too. It's like ska is its own genre.
Yeah,
And I have total respect for ska punk and hardcore, ska core. I have these are subgenres. I see them more as subgenres of ska. I mean, some people lean more punk than they do ska, but
yeah,
ska is its own genre and has its own history. And yes, yeah, it's interwoven with punk. I mean, two-tone ska was punk was an influence.
for sure it was. Yeah,
it was ska and rocksteady and reggae mixed with sort of punk rock and sort of post-punk stuff happening. So punk was in the stew from a pretty early point in ska history.
yeah.
But that doesn't mean that you need punk to play ska. You don't. There's plenty of, the Slackers, they don't really have any punk in their music, even if they have like a sense of, like if they like to think of themselves as kind of punky dudes, they don't have punk in their music.
Sonically, no. Attitude
Yeah.
wise, sure, but sonically, not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. And they were sort of lumped in with that whole scene as well because of the Hellcat Records connection, and they were on all these again with the compilations. That's how I heard Hepcat and the Slackers and all these bands first. Being in Canada and not. I don't think they were touring up here very often at that point, at least. And that's that first Give 'Em the Boot compilation. I heard Hepcat, I heard
Hmm.
the Slackers, I heard Dave Hilliard's his solo thing, all those bands, and then I still listen to most of them sort of today, but it was definitely sold on a punk compilation. I was going to ask you though, I know you had that sort of in-depth chat with Matt from the Planet Smashers, and you covered a
Hmm.
lot of sort of the history of Canadian ska and the Stomp Records,
Yeah.
and it was very interesting. As someone who was tangentially involved in the sense that I was going to ska shows here in Winnipeg, and I was playing in a shitty ska band at the time. Like we opened for the Planet Smashers a couple times, stuff like that. But I mean, I wasn't really part of their whole thing at all. But it was cool to listen to that and sort of fill in some gaps of stuff that I was curious about. But what was your did you have any concept of Canada's ska scene at the time? Like with the Planet Smashers a band on your radar sort of at their peak?
So yeah, I was gonna tell you, I was gonna give you a little a Canadian ska history from the U.S.
Sure, I'd
perspective.
love to hear that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. King Apparatus definitely was known down here because I think they had a deal with Moon
Okay.
for distribution. So they weren't as big as they were up there.
They're huge here,
But
yeah. Yeah.
yeah, that one record with their biggest songs that was distributed down here from Moon. So
Okay.
I definitely had that record. They didn't tour too much down here because they broke up once they were really starting to make some movement. Um, Planet Smashers are probably the most known Canadian ska band in the US. I mean, that's because they toured so much down
Yeah, they
here.
did, yeah, yeah.
They did the Ska's Dead tour. They did all kinds of touring, especially like in the 2000s, actually.
So
So
post the third wave boom.
yeah. No, they really like I think he talked about that on my episode. They really made a movement for a good chunk of the 2000s to like get into the US market. Now Bedouin, they've toured actually quite a bit in the US, but they haven't cracked the US in any kind of commercial way.
Yeah.
Uh, Now once you get beyond those three bands, it's super obscure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I can't really think of I guess what's his face? The Flatliners started as a ska punk band. I mean,
Yeah, their first record, yeah.
that band's totally known down here. I don't know how many US Flatliners fans are aware of their early ska punk record though. Because that was
That's
kind of like, yeah.
that's
That
the
kind of
main way
like
I know them is from that. I actually listened to that record and then I heard the next one and it wasn't ska and I was like, I'm not into this so much. But yeah, I can see that for sure. It's
because they got
interesting.
signed to Fat Records after that record.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny because Stomp Records, like to me as a teenager, sort of in the '90s, listening to this stuff and being really into it, it seemed like such an important label. To the point where I figured everyone must have known these bands. Everyone must know who Whole Lotta Milk is, even though I'm seeing them, like once a week at the Albert or something in Winnipeg, and there's
Yeah.
a handful of people there. It seemed like it was such a bigger deal, and they were on these compilations that were going across the country, and it's interesting to sort of listen to your stuff with Matt and some of the other episodes and realize that this wasn't outside of the little bubble of Canadian ska bubble. This wasn't really a thing at all.
Yeah. But I think like there wasn't a ton of bands out, okay, so in general, when it comes to music, it is difficult for non-US bands to crack the US. That
For
is just
sure.
a thing across genre. US audiences are very picky about non-US bands, and there's all kinds of logistical issues. I know like to tour here is very challenging. There's like expensive immigration, or it's
Definitely.
not immigration, it's whatever it's called.
Getting
Work
across the
work
border is a pain
permits.
in the ass. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And it's expensive. It's very expensive. So it is difficult for bands to crack the US. And we kind of think of ourselves as like the center of the universe when it comes to entertainment. So
Well, and not without good cause too. I mean, like
sure.
you have so many more people than we do, right? You have like 10 times the population, and that means at least 10 times the bands. So I get it. I get it for sure. And half the stuff I was listening to that it got me into ska was, yeah, it was Whole Lotta Milka and JFK and the Conspirators and all these local bands, but and the Planet Smashers. But it was also, some of the other bands we mentioned. It was Fishbone. It was Hepcat. It was the Slackers. So it makes sense. It seeps into here, and we can't stop it. American influence. We can't prevent it from crossing the border.
I don't know what it was like for you for Canada, but two-tone ska was really an obscure thing in the 80s. Two-tone ska was very popular in England, but it was really obscure. It was very underground here.
Well,
Did not really crack much of any like cultural interest. And Madness had literally one single here in the U.S. and that
was
was
it Our House,
Our House. Yeah,
which is not ska at all.
no, it's not ska.
Yeah, yeah,
It's weird because we talked to Suggs and he's just like kind of he doesn't understand at all why that one song in particular cracked our
yeah,
charts because that in England they had like I
yeah.
don't
They
know
had
like
tons of hits.
20 30 hits. I mean it's
Yeah.
ridiculous.
Well, it's funny too because I like the reason I got into ska in the first place. I think is yeah, it's partially because of some of the punk bands like Rancid having ska songs in their albums, and but before
Mhm.
that, like my dad's from England. He brought a bunch of records to Canada with him. Among those records were the specials, were Madness. A lot of these bands that I mean, even the Clash and stuff that were when I was a kid listening to and I loved the One Step Beyond album as a kid. And then when I realized as a teenager, wait, this is the same music that I'm listening to now from all these punk bands. The connection was made, but I don't think I had any concept of whether this was popular or not. It was popular in my house. Like,
Sure,
that
yeah.
was sort of the only thing I knew, right? So I'm not even sure what the reception was to those two-tone bands here in Canada.
Mhm.
I imagine it was probably pretty similar to the States. With I know Our House still gets played on the radio here, and I don't
Mhm.
think I've heard a Madness song aside from on like a campus radio ska show ever on the radio. So yeah, I think it's the same kind of vibe.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird. It's really weird to like I guess maybe what do you think is the future of this? Because I know there's all these new bands, and some of them I like, some of them I don't, and that's not really the point here. Some of them I really don't like, some of them I understand the appeal. Some of them, but it's different, right? It's not the same ska that I grew up listening to or playing or any of that. And I like that. I like that it's changed. I like that it's evolved. But do you see this becoming any bigger than it is now? Like, is there enough momentum? There doesn't seem to be here, the way there was 30, 25, 30 years ago. But it looks like in the States, there's a lot more bands that are starting up, getting some attention. There's some kind of tours happening with a lot of
Mhm.
bands. Do you foresee any kind of increased attention being given to ska, or will it stay this underground thing that has its fans, but doesn't necessarily go above that?
It's really hard to tell. I mean, there was a lot of excitement for the Bad Time Records bands a couple of years ago, and they did the New Tone documentary. This is New Tone. There was so much excitement for that tour, and I thought the documentary came out good. But I watched that documentary, and I kind of feel like we're already kind of in this new place where it's like, what's next? And it feels like something there could be a curveball that comes out and totally elevates ska even more.
Yeah,
One of those bands could release like a new record that is totally an innovative record and blows everyone's mind, or it could fizzle out. I mean, it's really hard to tell. I feel like, I kind of feel like anything's possible. I think that, from my point of view, the way I look at it, I think the more the more that the legacy itself is getting repaired, the more opportunity there is for just somebody to make a record and it to be received well. And it to not be so like this hyper fixation on the fact that it's ska, good or
yeah.
bad, which I feel like is just not really necessary. We don't have to be just like hyper focused on the fact that it's ska, which seems to kind of go with the territory,
It
right?
does. Actually, those old Stomp records, like in the '90s, they all said "File under ska" on the back of the CD. So
Yeah.
definitely, the bands were definitely putting that on themselves to sort of push the fact that they were ska bands. But I know what you mean. Yeah, I think that having that label attached to it is going to unfortunately push some people away because they have this preconceived notion, and hopefully some band will come along that incorporates ska into their sound and just without saying the three-letter word, they'll
Yeah, yeah.
they'll
And I think what would be really interesting is if, and I think this is totally possible. And I think if it did happen, I don't even know if we'd be able to predict who would do it. But I think it's entirely possible that like some pop artists will start
yeah,
incorporating ska. Just because pop producers are constantly trying to find things to make their song sound interesting and different. And if you distill ska down to more of its essence, like you remove it from the sort of the 90s sound, from its more punk oriented sound, it's dance music, it's pop music, it's catchy music.
yeah.
Like if you really lean in those directions, it could make good pop songs. And like the artist doesn't even have to like know anything about ska really.
They
It's
probably
the
wouldn't
people.
at that point. The producer
Yeah,
would sort of deliver it to them and
it's
say, "Hey,
the
this
it's
is the
just
new
I mean
beat." This, yeah,
they'll just hear dance music,
yeah,
and that could have an effect too,
for sure. Yeah, yeah. Hopefully that does happen. That would be a good way to sort of subtly sneak it back into the into the conversation.
I I would actually very much like ska to be reintroduced into a more substantial way as dance music.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm down with all the bands playing like heavy ska. That's cool. I like it. I just don't think reintroducing ska in a significant way as a subgenre of punk is really the way to go. But I think like if ska is like done like this is dance music, this is soulful music, this is like if it's a Latin artist doing a little bit more of a Latin version, or if it's
yeah,
electronic music, like that's a way where I think it'll really be like distinguished and separate from the 90s and this like all the jokes, the mozzarella sticks, the whole nine. Like it'll be a totally new and different thing.
yeah, for sure. I think that could work. So if people are hearing about you for the first time in the show, they maybe they don't know the book exists, and this is hopefully introducing them to the podcast and the book. Where do they find
Mhm.
your stuff? I know the second edition is yet to come out at the time we're recording this, but what's the best way to sort of keep up with what you're up to? Book, podcast, anything else?
Well, the podcast is just available wherever you get your podcasts, and we release episodes every Wednesday. You can follow me on social media. It's at In Defense of Ska on Twitter,
Yeah,
Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and if you'd like to, you can pre-order the book now. It's on bookshop.org, or I think Amazon, Clash Books. You can get it directly from my publisher.
Cool.
You can just go and pre-order it, and you'll just get the book on the day it's released. And it's pre-orders, by the way, pre-orders are very good for authors because first week sales are extremely important for how the algorithms treat our book going forward.
Sure.
And all pre-orders are treated like first week sales.
Good
So
to know. So yeah, pre-order the
yeah,
book. If you're curious to hear more about this, I mean, people should
yeah.
definitely go back through the archives of your podcast too, because some of the people you've interviewed are even some of the ones that I wasn't necessarily a fan of initially. Going and listening to sort of what they have to say about this whole genre and everything connected to it, it's fascinating. So yeah, definitely check out the book. It's a cool read. The podcast is great, and I'm glad we could do this
All right, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
for sure.